Hi, George.
What are we doing here? What are we doing here? It's Red Fence!
It's Red Fence.
Do your homework! Hi, Acton.
Hi, George.
We are on Apple Podcasts, people. Explicit content marker checked.
Yes.
Because apparently explicit for Apple means anything your child can't listen to. And it's like, well, that's like everything. I mean, unless there's like kid podcasts, which I bet there are.
That's right. And there's the occasional swear, so.
Oh my god, it's just the topics, the language. Yeah. Nothing is child appropriate on this show.
That's right. Very inappropriate. On that note.
Let's
talk about sex.
Let's talk about sex. All the single ladies. All the single ladies.
We will be talking about the sexual revolution, both its aspirations and its unintended consequences, by looking at two books.
The Case Against the Sexual Revolution by Louise Perry, contrasted with Helen Gurley Brown's Sex and the Single Girl.
Yes.
Released in, 62?
Mm-hmm.
I want to say?
Yep. But let's start with our first things first. So our question is, what was your experience like learning about the birds and the bees from your parents and in school?
Ooh, I can't believe we're talking about this in public, but that's why I'm having wine. Go for it.
All right. I'll go first. So the things that I learned about sex in the setting of my home, whether through conversation or books or movies, those were way more helpful to me than anything I learned at school. I mean, my sex ed experiences in public school in the 90s were a combination of like mortifying co-ed situations and decontextualized diagrams and semi-sciencey vocab. So sex ed in school was simultaneously humiliating and boring, which honestly are the last two emotions anyone should ever have about sex.
True that.
So I remember being in 5th grade and they separated the boys and the girls so that we could learn all about periods. And that made me feel both gross and embarrassed. It seemed like such a hassle. I remember being in 7th grade health class, and this time they kept the boys and the girls together, which seems unfathomably dumb to me, in my opinion, to keep us together at that age, like when you're 13. And hearing the young female teacher talk to us all about boners, and everyone just laughing,
that's
and it being so awkward. Yeah,
that's wrong.
That's the only thing I remember from that class, is hearing her say the word boner in front of everybody.
Oh, the mistakes of liberalism.
I know. And I remember in my freshman year of high school, I had to watch a movie in health class about date rape. And compared to the kind of things that I'd seen on TV prior to then, it was relatively explicit in what it showed. I mean, it's probably totally tame compared to everything now. But at the time, it was very disturbing to me. And, you know, they also showed a video to the whole class, guys and girls, about how to perform a self-exam for testicular cancer.
I mean, why do the girls need that?
I don't know. So I was just like, you know, head down, eyes closed. I was like, oh, I do not want to see this. I'm sure they also talked to us about contraception, but I don't really remember that. I wasn't really paying attention to that because I knew that I wasn't going to have sex until I was married, and so the whole thing just felt like this embarrassing waste of time. And I found it offensive, really, because I knew from my family and from my faith that sex was special, that I felt it was sacred, and so having something that, like, intuitively I felt was so precious, kind of like dragged out in front of a room of awkward co-ed teenagers, it felt like that pearls before swine feeling. And it didn't feel appropriate to me, especially with being co-ed. It was tone deaf. So I kind of just suffered through it and tried not to pay attention. But what I learned about sex at home, I think was just right. My mom gave me this short illustrated Christian book called How You Got to Be You when I was like 9 or 10. I still have it. Like, I've like put it in the bathroom for my kids to like find whenever they're interested.
Clever.
Like, I'm
calculating.
Like, they'll find it, right? And she read a little bit of it to me, and some of it I read on my own. And it had pictures and diagrams, you know, and it talked about puberty and sexual attraction and marriage and what husbands and wives do to love one another, you know, and where babies come from. But the whole thing, while it was relatively straightforward, it managed to be modest and not disgusting. And I think that's because sex was contextualized within marriage and within what we talked about in episode 3, the unitive and procreative aspects of sex.
Mm-hmm.
Like, the joys of sex bring you close to your spouse and they make a family, and that's delightful. Like, it just had a really, like, a sweetness and an innocence and a straightforwardness about it that I really liked. And the book framed it like, and that's how you got here because your parents love each other.
Well,
you know, so it made you feel like, oh, I'm special. I come from my parents loving each other.
That's the happy
nice.
path for sure. That's
the
happy path. It's a great happy path.
Right.
That is the happy path.
Yeah, and so I think
it's
that's
true
blessing.
to the extent it's a truthful happy path. Unfortunately, it's just not the only path.
Right.
But yeah,
that's right. Yeah, but I think if you're going to introduce it to kids, why not start with the best case scenario?
Absolutely.
Right.
I couldn't agree more.
Yeah, and so it had this feeling of continuity to it, and it presented sex as something important to look forward to, but don't worry if it feels a little weird to you right now. Like, it acknowledged that.
Right, because you would have perhaps been asking these questions before you were feeling those urges that drive people to want these things.
Exactly. Like at 9 or 10, you're
curious about the how it happens, but you haven't quite arrived at the place where you're like, oh, I feel this thing. What is this thing?
Exactly. Right. So I didn't have that kind of self-awareness yet. But I don't think that book talked about contraception. It wasn't a Catholic book, but they just didn't bring it up. And again, I think for first intro, it's like, that's fine. Because that's a whole other thing. So I didn't feel embarrassed learning about sex in that context. I felt private, but I didn't feel ashamed. And so now and then I would still ask my mom questions, and she would answer them very succinctly, like no extra information,
the least
but accurately.
You needed to satisfy.
Yes, minimum effective dose. And if I wanted any more, I'd have to pressure for more, and I didn't. I just
because you could sense
that she would just give enough, because she, in a way, she didn't want me imagining it a lot, but I was curious, so she wasn't trying to feed my imagination, but just enough, My parents were very loving and flirtatious with each other, so anything that I did learn about sex, it was kind of drawn into the center of gravity that organized each new bit of knowledge. Like, sex is for cultivating what my parents have.
It's just a compartment. It's just a place in a house called intimacy, but there's a bigger part of the house.
Exactly.
It's just one room that you don't know a lot about, but it's one room over there.
Right. And so any little bit that I would gather about sex from something I watched or something I read, it would go into that category of like, oh yeah, that's for that sacred, private, wonderful room over there that I don't know much about yet. It's sort of like a hold that thought, for something good, kind of tuck that away in the way that you look forward to a present at Christmas. And you're like, I don't know what's in it, but I know it's going to be great and I can't wait. And it had this anticipatory, but I'm fine to wait kind of delight in it.
You must have also assumed you'd get married before you were 30, though.
I did.
We can talk about that more later,
true.
but it
that
makes
would
a difference.
That would make a difference, for sure. And as a teenager, I was always really drawn to romantic stories and literature and movies, and any hints of sex that I might read about or see were typically in a context of love and intimacy. And sex was like you're saying, it's like this hidden center of a connection that's private and that shouldn't be trotted out into the open and displayed. But it was like this mysterious beating heart of the man-woman connection that I sensed was very beautiful but it was mysterious and it was alluring and it was off limits, but that's okay because it's not time yet. So it felt all right. And I mention that because, just in case listeners might think, oh, that's so, puritanical or prudish or something. But, to me, it wasn't. As a kid, I was interested in sex. I wasn't ashamed of it. But I had a deep sense as a kid that it's special. And so it should be approached with this sense of privacy and honor. And so in that sense, I think the sex ed that I got on my own, and in the context of home, it was erotic without being explicit. And that it fueled desire without, shocking me. Right, yeah. And I will admit, true confessions, I borrowed my parents' old 1970s copy of The Joy of Sex. At the time, as a teenager, that felt very transgressive to do that. I felt like I was being sneaky. I was like, but
because you don't realize, you have no frame of mind to realize that your parents were young, because you think your parents came into the earth fully formed when you popped into it.
Right.
I mean, that literally is the mindset.
Yeah. That's true.
It's ridiculous, but it's true.
Yes. And in light of all the internet porn that's available today, now looking back and I'm like, oh, how sweet and safe to learn about those things.
Yeah,
much safer. A grown-up's book for married couples with some pencil drawings. That sounds just about right.
With some erotic, classic erotic art, basically.
Yeah. So, and again, it's the context was marriage. At least that was, it fit within a frame of marriage, and so it didn't feel weird or gross, even though it felt exciting to think about. But I ended up getting married at 20. So after that, I learned from experience, which is the best way. So I did not have to wait very long. So I do not know what that would be like if you're looking at a decade or more.
I mean, I think those two expectations are directly correlate. I mean, I think we've talked about this before. Yeah. That it's definitely, it's not that hard to wait to get married if everyone's getting married by the time they're 20 or 21. Or even earlier. I mean, Friedan talks about that period where everybody's getting married at 18, 19.
That's right.
You
only have a few years of kind of being online before you have the fulfillment of what you're thinking about all the time.
Right.
Yeah, but our culture definitely delays, and more is delaying.
Right, and so that creates this. Yeah,
I mean, space. It's really
and it's different to be, a celibate, to use a not appropriate term, but what's the better one? Mm-hmm. A celibate teenager than a celibate 25-year-old. I mean, they just have completely different cultural connotations.
Yes, very much so.
I mean, that, in fact, we're going to talk about spinsterhood later, and that is really, it occurs to me as we're having this conversation, that one of the central tenets of spinsterhood was virginity.
Yes.
And that colored it, right? Yeah. It wasn't just being not married. In fact, it probably wasn't even really, it was about being untouched.
Right.
Because that was the paradigm, right? The people who got married lost their virginity, and if you didn't get married, it was just assumed that you were still a virgin.
Right.
So that's interesting to think about, right?
Yeah, that's the whole thing. And so I never actually, I wasn't exposed to porn as a kid.
Have you ever watched anything as an adult?
No. I've never, like, tried, because I've always had the sense of, like, that would, like, don't even start. Yeah, because I just know people fall down the rabbit hole.
Oh, so, that's so not the risk with women. So, the risk is with women. It's just like, oh my God, I'm going to physically be sick.
Like you throw up, yeah. Like, I mean, even just reading about things from what Louise Perry talks about in her book, I'm like, ooh.
Well, I don't mean that kind of porn. I mean more classic porn. I would never watch any modern porn, but I don't think porn does a lot for most women. Of course, there are exceptions. But it's not, the risk isn't that you're going to get so into it. The risk is that you're going to be like, oh my God, this is horrible that this is a thing.
My favorite philosopher, Roger Scruton, he wrote, in pornography, desire is detached from love and attached to the mute machinery of sex. This is damaging to adults in just the same way that modern sex education is damaging to children, for it undermines the possibility of real erotic love, which comes only when the sexual act is hedged round with prohibitions and offered as a gift and an existential commitment. I feel like that beautifully describes, like, the contrast between my experience of sex ed at school, which was so disappointing, and then sex ed at home, in which sex was always viewed as this gift, as this existential commitment. And so the hedges had a really good purpose, and so they never felt cruel, they never felt arbitrary. It was, like it's the same way that you hedge anything special or breakable or of great value. It's the same thing like that for me. So I ended up learning what I need to learn without being scarred for life.
And that makes me think about how much easier it is to put those hedges around it when you grow up in a family where your parents are married, where your two parents are present.
Yes.
Because it doesn't hold to say sex is this magical, intimate thing if you've never lived with your father, for example. And you've only lived with your mother. It doesn't. You can't show that as an example.
Right. The story of your parents love each other so much. And
right.
How you
and we stay together and we have a family and
that's right.
So it doesn't. So that context is missing.
Yeah.
And it must be much harder to explain that.
Yeah. Right. It kind of shatters the story. And so, like, okay,
right,
so
and if that story is the story that you used to preserve the innocence until an adult can come into his or her own realization of what sex is and what it could be, yet without that convenient setting, it's much harder to convince a child that sex is just one little room in the house of intimacy.
Yes, that's a great way to say it. Yeah, that's beautiful.
So,
well, how about you?
I don't remember having any sex ed in school. Which doesn't mean there wasn't any.
Maybe you conveniently forgot it.
Maybe. I mean, I've forgotten a lot of things. Like, I have friends who tell me, remember when da-da-da-da-da? I'm like, I believe you, but no. Although I think if something that awkward had happened to me, like talking about boners in a mixed-sex classroom, I think I would remember that. That's a no-brainer, it would seem to me, to never do any sex ed that's not sex-segregated.
Yeah.
That sounds horrid. So my parents had The Joy of Sex and the sequel. More Joy.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
I never read More Joy. Maybe I need to get More Joy.
And I likewise snuck about to read them, although I'm sure my parents would not have cared. They weren't hidden away. They were just in the living room with the rest of the bookshelves.
Okay.
With the rest of the bookshelves. On the bookshelf with the rest of the books. And I also learned a thing or two about intimacy from, are you ready? Sit down. You're already sitting. Walking in on my parents.
Ooh, that's like my nightmare.
Yes. It was as awkward as you could imagine.
Yes. Yeah.
It was upsetting, mainly because I was embarrassed. But, I mean, that already tells you something, right?
Yeah.
Is that you know to be embarrassed.
Right. Like, I should not be
and it wasn't like, it wasn't a pornographic vista. It was just it was an intimate vista. Let's say that.
Did one of them, or did your mom talk to you about it afterwards?
Yeah, no, I, of course, burst into tears, and my mom, they got through. My parents were good parents. They knew what they were doing.
Yeah.
And that's how I learned to knock. And this was I obviously must have understood I must have had some understanding of the scope, but this wasn't when I was a teenager. This was earlier. I must have been like maybe, I don't even think I was 10. I must have been somewhere in that. Oh. Yeah. Somewhere in that sort of like, not a total child, because I think a total child wouldn't have understood. Be like, what are you doing about? Right. But not a total child, but definitely pre-adolescent. Yeah. I'm not actually sure that this experience is that uncommon.
I don't think it. I think it's.
I mean, that's common. The reason they call it the Oedipal right?
Right. And that's when your parents got a lock on the door.
Well, there's that option. There's also the knocking option. Yes. We were an unlocked door kind of house.
Oh, were you?
We were like, I always think that people are divided into two camps when it comes to their houses. Have you ever noticed that certain people close doors when there's no one in the room?
Yes. Yep. Mm-hmm.
See, I have always grew up with the opposite.
It's like open door.
Open doors. Okay. A door is open by default and closed by selection. By intention. Interesting. Yeah. Anyway. Okay, yeah. The informative value of that experience, let's say, outweighed whatever discomfort it induced. It brought home to me one key component of sex: privacy. Yep. Not secrecy, but privacy. Right. So in some ways, I think sex ed in school undermines that essential component. I can't imagine learning in a classroom about, for instance, masturbation. Like, that just seems... It seems like telling the kids that who still think there's Santa Claus that there's no Santa Claus. Because you can't gauge the appropriateness of that information. No. Like, when I had questions to which the answer turned out to be masturbation, my mother understood what I was asking, and she's like, here, read this. And she hands me, like, Dr. Spock.
Okay, there you go.
Which covers it. Yeah. I mean, it doesn't maybe necessarily think that you're giving it to your kid to read, but my mother didn't care. She knew I was literate. She was like, read this.
Read this.
You'll understand.
Right, and you can read it in the privacy of your own
Exactly.
room.
Take it into your bedroom, your private bedroom, and you read, and you're like, oh, okay. So, again, privacy, not secrecy. Because, I mean, you need someone to initiate you. Mm-hmm. It's one of those things, if you're a parent and you're so terrified of being that person who in some way informs your own child about these things, well, you gotta just grow up. Yeah. Now that there's, the internet, I'm not really sure what function sex ed really serves. I mean, it's definitely a front in the culture wars now. Mm-hmm. And of course it's hopeless because the whole thing is wrapped up in gender woo now. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And of course the exposure to porn, which is only going to stop when parents stop giving smartphones and private internet access to their children. And again, this idea of private internet access, right? There's a bit of an oxymoron in there because the heart of this mess that we're in is that we actually don't allow children privacy. We think we're giving them privacy when they're in the room, but if you give them the internet, you've undone it all because we've got it backwards. The internet, by design, has no concept of privacy. It just doesn't. These kids are growing up without any mental or visual space to form a gradual, age-appropriate notion of their own sexuality. I learned about sex led by my own experience of my maturing body. Mm-hmm. Like, it was just completely self-directed. Like, you feel it, and you wonder what it is, and then you ask, and then you learn, and then gradually that experience comes to incorporate other people.
That makes so much sense. That seems so right.
Yeah. So it's like you have feelings, you have visual materials and conversations, and in my case, a little, an Oedipal scene. But that was pre-sexual awakening for me. And so those become the supplement to the learning process, but not the main source of it. Yeah. I don't even think that this kind of body-led individual awakening is even possible in today's porn-saturated culture. So sad. And when I say porn-saturated, I mean everything from actual porn, which we know... Like, I think I read something about, like, X% of Pornhub's users are, like, under 12 or something. No. Yeah. My first question was, how do they know? But, yeah. I don't know. Whatever. Yeah. And anyway, even if it's, like, only half true, it's still horrible. Mm-hmm. So, like, actual porn or what we might call Hollywood porn, whether it's shows that show a lot of, like, casual sex, like Euphoria, which I admit I haven't watched, but I've read reviews about it and I've seen the trailers, or Industry, which I did watch, or a mostly naked Lizzo twerking, or the wet ass pussy video. That you should watch.
No, I can't do it.
Because
I can't do it.
Oh yeah, like that is interesting, shall we say? It makes no difference to me if the women that make this Hollywood porn are making money from it, or even enjoying themselves. Because my problem isn't with them. As a liberal, I believe they have a right to make that content. But I also think, as a culture, we have the possibility of holding a social norm by general consensus that this content is not appropriate for minors ever.
Right.
Which means that it can never be on cable.
Right.
We can't be just there. Right. And a lot of the conservative phrase for this is family friendly, but I actually don't really like that language because I don't think that these values have to do with what shape your household is in at all.
Yeah.
I think it's really specifically about children.
Okay.
Children are ignorant and they're gullible, and this makes them really vulnerable to unvirtuous people who would exploit them.
Yeah.
I'm not a mother, but I am over the age of 30, and I think everyone that age is old enough to have intuited through contact with children, say like children under 10, how exploitable people that age are.
Oh yeah.
They just trust you.
They do.
And that goes double, triple if they have wonderful parents.
Yes. Yeah.
They think everyone is like their parents, which is kind of the purpose of upbringing in a way. I mean, I thought no one had credit card debt because my parents were like, credit cards are for convenience. Yeah. Right? I was like,
pay it off.
I had graduated from college before I met someone who was like, oh, I have all this debt. And I was like, oh, you mean everyone's not like my parents? I had lived in Europe. I had a college degree and still I was like,
what?
Bubble.
Right.
Bubble. So
right.
Children are like super bubble, right?
Yeah.
So if you haven't had that experience of the vulnerability of children, you're like, there's something wrong with you. Because I think it's just obvious when you meet a young child. And this goes for not just girls, but boys also.
Yes.
They're both vulnerable because of their innocence.
Yes.
And I'm not a pedophile, so I won't know, and thus I can't tell you what it feels like to want to abuse a child. I have no insight into that. But having been a child, I can tell you that the first step, the sine qua non of healthy sexual development for a young person is to be protected by the adults in her life from the very few other adults who would abuse her or him.
Right. That's right.
Protect them from those predatory adults, and in general from an inappropriate premature loss of innocence, which is what obviously porn is. I mean, Billie Eilish has talked about this.
Oh, yeah.
It messes with your brain. And so part of that protection is having a public culture that is age appropriate for children. And I really feel like liberals have absolutely lost the plot on this issue. Even if we got rid of all the trans insanity, the permissiveness of our culture when it comes to explicit sexuality, be it straight, gay, or other, is frankly out of control.
Thank you for saying that.
It's not healthy for young people to grow up in this environment. And I think that the generation that the internet has poisoned in their childhood hopefully is not going to let their own children suffer this way. And I think that's a good thing. One of my goals is that you and I live to see a post-internet childhood generation. Yeah. We have a smoking age, we have a drinking age, and you're never going to catch everyone.
Right.
There's always going to be people whose parents let them have drinking parties. And, there's always going to be people who are getting some random adult to buy them cigs at the 7-Eleven. But we could do more to make the internet the exception rather than the rule.
That's right. Yeah. We could make those guardrails if we had the will to do it.
So that was a bit of a tangent, but I'll come back to, I feel like this whole issue of sex ed comes down to this idea that, like, sex ed is trying to make a sexual culture, and we're failing, right? This model that we're currently forwarding is damaging. It's broken. And so, yes, the original urge to include sex ed in public school came from the kind of an opposite problem. We've sort of swung too far in the opposite direction, right?
Yes.
I think that the state has a legitimate interest in keeping teenage out-of-wedlock pregnancy low.
Yep.
It's not good for the mother. It's not good for the child.
That's right.
And if your parents happen to be the types who would rather just pretend that their kids are going to do what they say and never have sex, and that's enough to say about it, it's not really entirely fair to the kid.
It's not.
I mean, birth control exists. I think young adults have the right to be taught that it exists, that it is legal, it's available. And I think it's in our collective interest as a nation to create women who become mothers when they are ready, not as a result of their innocent ignorance.
Yes.
I'm not against using traditional strategies to make young men behave better. I mean, when my husband was growing up, it was just taken for granted that if you behaved improperly with a young woman, her father was going to come for you. And not just reputationally, like physically.
He was going to beat you.
You were going to get something, a whipping from somebody. Because that was the rules.
Yeah.
If we want women to have better premarital experiences of sexual and non-sexual sorts, there needs to be a strong culture of restraint on young male sexual behavior. Yes. I mean, that just seems obvious.
Yeah.
right now, the broader culture seems to have even stopped asking the question of whether women actually enjoy or benefit from the complete abandonment of this kind of culture of sexual honor, and to enforce that honor, stigma. Yes. I mean, there just doesn't seem to be any awareness of or acknowledgement of the obvious downsides.
Right.
So, I don't want people to get pregnant in high school because nobody told them there's condoms and contraception. But I don't want... There's no need to teach fifth graders about masturbation. They'll figure it out on their own.
Right.
Here's a great example of how different the age is. Like, I think I was in 4th grade, and I can remember being on the playground. Kids would play games on other kids based on their ignorance.
Yes.
And so somebody asked me, "Are you a virgin?"
Oh, I got that question.
And I didn't know what it meant.
Yeah.
So, of course, you want to say no, because it's probably something horrible.
We have the same story.
Right?
Yeah.
Right. And that's the joke, because then it's like, right? Because that kid knows what it means. Right.
And they've just embarrassed.
So this is an age, so that's the protective ignorance of innocence.
Yes.
That is, to not know what those words mean is healthy at that age.
That's right.
And yeah, there will be some trolling around it, but that's part of the gradual, that's how you awaken into that culture,
that's
right?
Yep.
But now you've got, kids in elementary school claiming they have this or that sexual identity. It's like
why
it's
are you
perverse.
Thinking about sex at all? You
but it's
thinking about that.
It's done because it's part of this social game now. It's totally detached from any developmental trajectory that is helpful.
Right. And the image you gave of sex is like this one beautiful little room in the household of intimacy, right? It's like taking that and extracting it from the story of that whole house and looking at it under a microscope in front of everyone and picking it apart. You're like, without the context, it harms people to learn about it.
It's damaging.
Yeah.
I mean, young people just don't have the mental capacity to understand what they're seeing or what they're learning. So.
Yeah. That's why, I really feel like the best sex ed is really actually not talking about sex explicitly at all. It's building up that whole household of intimacy. Of what is intimacy and what are relationships and what is sort of that dance, that juicy dynamic between male and female. Sort of the gendered dance. And the curiosity and the mystery and the whole story of that, the romance that would result in courtship and that would finally someday be sort of fulfilled in sex. It's leave that for the last little bit after everything else is in place. You've got the story, you've got the house built, right? Then you can kind of enter that room, and then I feel like it's not traumatic. It's it is like opening on Christmas morning. That was my experience of it.
It's like leveling up in a game. It's like you've completed the earlier levels.
Right.
And so there now you can play the bonus round.
Yeah, there you go. The bonus round. That's great. Excellent. So before we dive into, what we thought about the 2 books for today, I thought it'd be helpful to, we can read a brief quote from each of them at the beginning that kind of provides the gist for those who haven't read them or haven't.
Do your homework. Go ahead.
But one
final tangent. This is going to be a 3-hour episode. You do know that, right?
No.
Okay.
To break it in half.
Oh, we could do that.
We could break it in half.
That's actually a brilliant idea.
Yeah. I just want to go meta for a moment and say that with this episode, this may be the first time that we've had a fairly deep disagreement about the value and meaning of a text.
Yes.
So our responses to sex and the single girl are noticeably different, and I found myself feeling angry and defensive as I read it because I kept sensing that Helen Gurley Brown was being careless and cavalier with something which I hold to be sacred, namely marriage, sex, and the family, and that made it hard for me to be charitable to her. And I believe an aim of this podcast is to treat the authors of all the texts we read charitably and to find the best that there is to find in their perspective. And I'm so grateful that we're doing this podcast together because you were able to supply that charity when I couldn't. And so that is really good. Well, that should be there.
Well, you're welcome. And also, I feel vindicated by this because it's the first chance where I feel I can actually suss out, where we agree on the sort of priors, but we disagree on maybe the gap between those priors and the cultural expression.
Yes.
So I feel like I get to be the good liberal.
Yes, that's right.
Even though I've sort of left that church, I'm yeah, for good old time's sake.
That's right. You can defend it. Yeah, and so for those who might be wondering, what is the big deal? Why was Acton so offended? I thought I might offer an example or two to help non-religious folks kind of get the nature of religious sensitivity.
I can't wait for that. That sounds awesome.
So it's the same feeling that a veteran might experience if they saw the flag being dragged in the mud, or the feeling a Native American might have when like an oil company wants to run a pipeline through your ancestral land. And they're thinking, oh, this makes perfect sense. You're like, you don't get it.
Right.
This is untouchable.
Yes.
This means something to us.
Right.
Right. But to the company, they're like, I don't see it. This looks like ground. This is dirt, right? You're like, this is not just dirt. So it's the pain of expecting reverence because you feel reverence is due, but then that expectation isn't met. As a Catholic author, Dietrich von Hildebrand, he wrote in his book, Liturgy and Personality, he wrote, reverence is the essential basis for such a perception of values and for a true relationship with the whole realm of values, with what is above and what speaks from above, the absolute, the supernatural, the divine. Reverence is the mother of all virtues, of all religion. I think in our culture, the opposite of reverence is like a shrug. It's casualness. And so as a person who believes that the sacred is an objective reality, like I don't think it's just in my head. Like,
right. It's not just a way of, it's not an interpretation.
No, it's beyond interpret. Like we all have to interpret, but I think there's a sacred reality there, which I'm attempting to interpret, and so I organize my life around attuning to and reverencing the sacred. And so I have to learn how to deal with the pain of others not experiencing the world in the same way that I do, not seeing what I see and not honoring what I honor. That means the flip side of religious liberty is this pain. Because others are free to determine their own values, right? If I have the freedom to worship as I see and understand, that also means you do, and Joe Schmo does, and you may honor something completely different from me, and you may be oblivious to or intentionally dishonor the thing that I honor, right? And that is its own kind of pain. But that pain has to be allowed to just stay where it is because we're a liberal society where we have that freedom. The freedom and the pain are the same. They're just two sides of the same coin. It's the same thing. And I also would say, in my response to Helen Gurley Brown, there's a twinge of like mama bear anger in me too, because I think that the degrading sexual culture prevalent today, which I think we both agree about, is very degrading. I think that is an offspring of earlier attitudes that began to be cavalier about sex. The initial, the shrug, it grows like a snowball, at least is my perception. And it has become what it is now. And I see so many young women suffering in this culture, from that. And I wish that things were better for their sake. And so some of the sharp edges of mine that might come out here as we talk about this, they're related to this struggle that I have and to this spiritual pain that I feel. And I just want to put that out there before we begin, to say that even though you and I have very different perspectives on certain things, we're both aiming at the same thing, which is reality-based living. We both care about reality. And that means that we are holding things in tension. Or I think a better way to say it, we hold things in friendship.
Amen.
So, there we go.
Well said.
All right. So, first quote from Sex and the Single Girl.
Theoretically, a nice single woman has no sex life. What nonsense. She has a better sex life than most of her married friends. She need never be bored with one man per lifetime. Her choices of partners is endless, and they seek her. They never come to her bed duty-bound. Her married friends refer to her pursuers as wolves, but actually many of them turn out to be lambs, to be shorn and worn by her. Sex, as we have said, is enjoyed by single women who participate not to please a man as might have been the case in olden times, but to please themselves.
She's so spicy.
She is like... She is sui generis.
Yes.
She really is.
Yep. So that's Brown in a nutshell. And here's a brief quote to introduce the case against the sexual revolution by Louise Perry. The technology shock of the pill led sexual liberals to the hubristic assumption that our society could be uniquely free from the oppression of sexual norms and could function just fine. The last 60 years have proved that assumption to be wrong. We need to re-erect the social guardrails that have been torn down. And in order to do that, we have to start by stating the obvious. Sex must be taken seriously. Men and women are different. Some desires are bad. Consent is not enough. Violence is not love. Loveless sex is not empowering. People are not products. Marriage is good. And, above all, listen to your mother. I love that. Listen to your mother.
Listen to your mother.
So my initial response to Sex and the Single Girl. Last time, our last podcast, we read Betty Friedan, and she was a formidable thinker and a good writer. And she makes a strong case in The Feminine Mystique. And even though I disagree with Friedan on a number of things, I can see how insightful she is. Like, she was trying to make a real argument intended to elevate women socially, intellectually, and morally. So even if I disagreed with her, there's something there to disagree with. Like, she's formidable, and I admire her. But reading Helen Gurley Brown was a disappointment to me. Brown was the editor of Cosmopolitan magazine for decades. And
after this book was written, we might add.
And so her book sounds kind of shallow. It's kind of gossipy, breezy, self-help magazine column style. Because of that style, I don't know. I mean, maybe you can push back on this, but I don't think Sex and the Single Girl is making an argument. Like, she's not researching something. She's not making an argument the way that Friedan was. I feel like it wasn't even quite like a book. It's a patchwork of a bunch of different things put together that kind of don't feel to me like they quite fit together. But I feel like she's bullshitting. And I mean that technically. I don't mean to be...
I love this.
I'm going to do this.
Tell our audience what the technical definition of bullshit is, because they will need to know.
Yes. So Harry Frankfurt of Princeton wrote this great essay on the philosophy of bullshit called On Bullshit, in which he describes the bullshitter's carelessness about submitting to the constraints which the endeavor to provide an accurate representation of reality imposes on us. So the state of mind of the bullshitter is a lack of conscientiousness regarding making contact with reality and conforming to reality. So it's not even lying. Because to lie, you have to have some grasp of the truth because you're carefully covering it up or like going against it. But the heart of bullshit is not caring. It's this kind of breezy indifference to reality and to context, which is typically self-serving. Frankfurt writes, "It is just this lack of connection to concern with truth, this indifference to how things really are, that I regard as the essence of bullshit." And I read that and I thought, that is Helen Gurley Brown.
Kind of, yeah.
And perhaps someone might push back and say, well, Brown was just describing her personal experiences and her opinions.
That's
right?
No excuse, though.
And I don't think it's an excuse, But someone might say, well, she's being true to herself. Doesn't that count for something? It's her lived reality, right?
Oh, boy.
She's speaking her truth, right? But Frankfurt touches on this, too. He says, we've replaced correctness with sincerity, with speaking your truth.
Oh, he was ahead of the curve on that.
Oh, yeah.
Because didn't On Bullshit come out in was it the early 2000s, late 90s?
I'm not sure, actually.
Okay, because I remember ordering it. I have one of the nice little...
Oh, do you?
Yeah, somewhere in the
I just found a PDF online. We'll have to link to it so you guys can...
And show notes.
Read it. But Frankfurt says that we only know ourselves in relation to the rest of reality. So this means that being is always being with. And so if we give up on the enterprise of knowing what is the case outside of ourselves, if we could care less about our context, then we've also given up on knowing ourselves, because nobody exists in a vacuum. And this means the project of self-absorbed sincerity is bullshit too. So Brown is not off the hook for writing a very sincere, book-length, self-serving gossip column, in my opinion. So that's my first general critique of Brown, that she's bullshitting. And my second broad critique is this. I think she's Machiavellian. I just read through The Prince by Machiavelli this year for the first time, and as I was reading him, I thought, this is like being in the mind of like a predator, of a dangerous animal, like a lion or something. Like, if lions could talk, what would they say? Like, how would they plot? And like, what does pure power, uninhibited by conscience, sound like? And he almost had this like shocking innocence to him. It was so devoid of any moral compass or constraint or scruple. It was solely about the pragmatic acquisition of power. And that's why the thought of an animal predator came to mind. It's like, if a tiger eats you, has it done something evil, or was it just being a tiger? But that's kind of what came into my mind. That's what came in my mind as I was reading Machiavelli. And then I had a similar feeling reading Sex and the Single Girl. Brown's goal wasn't political power, of course. It was having a good time, having fun, feeling pretty, feeling special, doing the things that make you feel good. And it's a different goal for Machiavelli, but it still had this twinge of like indifference to moral constraints, or indifference to the harms that your behavior causes to others, like a lack of conscience or self-awareness. I think both are shameless. Like, that's the word I was looking for. Like, Machiavelli was shameless about power, and Brown was shameless about sex. So that's my rather harsh take on Brown.
Harsh, but not undeservedly harsh. I mean, actually, as we said earlier, I'm totally delighted that we have this really different reaction, because I agree totally. There's a super high vapidity bullshit quotient to her. I am so enthused to present, or attempt to present, a credible liberal defense of this book.
Great, go for it.
Andrew Sullivan, in his latest newsletter, talked about the idea of a conservative liberal, which I think I might have to admit that I am at this point. But liberal nonetheless. This will be a liberal defense. So let's talk about shame. So Brown is shameless, at least in how she openly discusses premarital sex, and she's almost sort of selling it, right? She's like, this is a pitch.
Great. Yeah.
And I watched recently the HBO documentary Being Mary Tyler Moore. And I think that documentary really helped me contextualize not just this book, but also Friedan's book. And I've been spending some of the time since we did that last episode, because she actually is in the beginning. You get to see her, and you're like, oh, this makes it much more real.
Yes.
Because there really was this sense of, in that time period, women just weren't taken seriously. I mean, the original Mary Tyler Moore show pitch was to make it about a divorcee. Mm-hmm. And the network was like, no, it's not happening. First of all, not appropriate. That's what they thought, even though it was reality. Mm-hmm. And second of all, they're going to think you divorced Dick Van Dyke.
I know!
That's the previous show.
Because it was such a great show. That's what I would have thought as a kid watching.
Exactly.
She left Rob Petrie.
Exactly. So we literally had a television culture that didn't want to be honest about how people lived, especially women. Yeah. Because there was this feeling that if we talked honestly about something, we'd be promoting it. And so I sort of see Brown's decision to be shameless as more about honesty, about a long-standing status quo, than it is about pushing sexual mores, like advancing them. I don't think her sexual mores are all that modern, to be honest. And they certainly aren't the free love mores that her book, due to its publication date and what followed, that she's retroactively been associated with.
That's true. That's very true.
I started reading the book, and I'm like, I can't believe this crap, right? Because I had the same reaction, like, in the introduction, which was, I think my edition was from 2012, and it talked about, who cares if, the relationship ends and you don't get married? The use has been extracted from it, or like, the good has been abstracted from it. Yeah. So this very technical, consumerist, kind of crass relationship language. Yes, she's totally guilty of that, and I don't mean to let her off the hook on that. But I had to go back and figure out how old this woman, when was this book written. She was born in 1922, so almost exactly a year after Friedan. And she was 19 in 1941 when she finished her education and entered the work world. Wow. This is the pre-World War II America, right? She married at 37 in 1959. So, she was having single woman sex in an era that was very much still bound by the traditional mores that protected women from male predation. This culture had plenty of room for flirtation, dating, and even sexual affairs, but it still put a lot of expectations on men and women that inspired caution. Abortion wasn't legal everywhere. There's no pill. If you got a woman pregnant, there would have still been a social pressure to marry her. Yeah. The marriage may not have lasted, but there was a sense of propriety about it. Yeah. And I don't even think young people today understand the term illegitimate as relates to a child born out of wedlock. I mean, and there's even a stronger term than illegitimate. Illegitimate was the term after they decided that calling those kids bastards was too much. Right. And this is like one of the things that young people don't understand is that, sex before marriage was probably not as uncommon as we like to think. But if you got pregnant, you got married. Right. Because it's not the sex while you're married that legitimates the birth of the child. It's the acceptance of the father to marry the mother and give the child his name. That's right. So you have to be married before the child is born. That's what legitimacy is. Right. So you're claiming that child is mine. Right. So Brown was operating in what we might call a kind of lax Protestantism, which was chaste and proper as far as appearances went, and when push came to shove, like with marriage. But, of course, people got up to all sorts behind closed doors. And that has nothing zero nada in common with the culture that she herself then proceeded to build that glorifies sex as fun. Yeah. Sex was fun, but it makes a difference whether you figure that out on your own in the context of general chastity propriety than to read about it on the cover of Cosmo when you're 11. Exactly. And I think that a close reading of the book really makes clear that most of what's fun about being single really isn't sex at all. It's the freedom of not being married. Or even more broadly, the relationships between men and women that are possible when the woman isn't married yet. Because what Brown seems to enjoy is meeting men, interacting with them. She likes attention, and I think that's a fine thing to admit. I think in the context of the time she grew up in, it was probably really fun to be single and out in the business world, which at that time was largely a world of men. So this is going to sound a bit crazy, But when she describes these situations where men are doting on these women they work with, they sound more like troubadours to me than creepy colleagues. Because a lot of the stuff they describe, like if you said, oh, this guy I work with keeps buying me gifts, it would be like, HR, sexual harassment,
that's right.
right away.
What's he expecting from me?
Right. This is harassment, right? But there exists, or existed anyway, a culture of men loving to love women. And expressing that love non-sexually. Maybe because sexual love isn't an option in whatever context the two find themselves. But also because it's actually just possible that attraction can be mixed with altruism and affection and a desire to serve. Obviously, a woman's mileage in terms of the quality of the men she interacts with is going to vary. Yeah. But the point I'm trying to emphasize here is that the culture Brown is talking about having sex in is not a hookup culture.
That's right.
It's a romantic culture, one that has a very long Western tradition. And worth pointing out, this tradition historically had nothing to do with marriage or sex.
Right.
I mean, sex obviously precluded inside marriage, or unless you're a prostitute. But so it was a tradition of romantic love that did not have anything to do with marriage. So this culture is what I want to say pre-sexual revolution sex.
Yes.
So it's continuing to be charitable to her. What kind of sex is this? Well, it's strategic rather than casual. And it has to be, considering the risks. And it's clearly at her discretion rather than as any sort of default expectation, which is a key difference than what we're going to talk about later.
She has the reins with it.
Right.
She does.
Brown is dating not because she does not want to marry, but because she doesn't want to marry yet. And I have a lot of sympathy for this attitude because I'm one of those women who married very late, at 38, to a divorced man. And thus, I benefited from the disappearance, really within my own lifetime, of the spinster. Right. As a girl, I can definitely remember the concept of the spinster, probably from literature I read that was written even earlier.
Yeah.
And yet I could also sense as I matured that it really wasn't going to be a problem if I didn't marry before I was 30.
Yeah.
I wasn't going to be considered automatically too old or ineligible.
That's great.
And it also didn't mean I had to be a virgin either. Which isn't to say that we shouldn't encourage marriage in one's 20s, especially for women who want children. I'm a big fan of that. But I, like Brown, didn't have a strong interest in starting a family, so this cultural shift towards a disappearance of spinsterhood, and specifically spinsterhood as virginity, was a positive. I resonated with that. We've talked about this before, how it's really not appropriate to give the same advice to all women, because not all women want the same things. And so Brown is definitely not giving advice for women who want to have children. Right. And that's why she can make this claim. She says, as for marrying to have children, you can have babies until you're 40 or older. And if you happen to die before they are 40, I mean, really? At least you haven't lingered into their middle age to be a doddering old bore. You also avoid those tiresome years as an unpaid babysitter. I mean, that's just silly. It's bullshit, like you say. It's not serious.
Right.
And much of the book isn't serious. For that reason, I don't think most of it is actually worth reading. Although, I mean, as a period piece. The beginning is interesting. I'll talk more about the beginning. But I think it's nonetheless worth pointing out that the values she promotes are not really the ones of the sexual revolution.
True.
She wants single women to be super frugal as they dress for success, not burn their bras. She wants them to surround themselves with men in the real world, not sit around swiping left or right. So yeah, Brown's style, her vapidity, the way she emphasizes the transactional in a lot of contexts, all terrible, all like vomitorious. But what she's defending beneath all that is something I think is valuable. A different, slightly rebellious, but sane and rewarding way to spend a decade or more enjoying unmarried life in the company, social and perhaps intimate, of men. She's lucky, thanks to the time she was born, that she got that chance. And it's truly ironic and sad that her preference for the cavalier here would end up becoming the norm and contributing to the erosion of the social mores that allowed her an extended, enjoyable period of what amounts to, best I can tell, courtship.
Yeah.
I mean, this is a classic case of do what I did, not what I say.
Yeah.
Because she's saying, just go have sex, it's fun. But that's not what she did.
Right.
She couldn't. That's not what she said. That's just, ugh.
Yeah. So that does make it hard to trust her message. You're like, then what parts can I extract from this that are like legit and helpful? Because I can't just do what you're telling me to do, especially not in the culture now, because men are so different from her time. But I think you're doing a beautiful job of being charitable to Brown in a way that I wasn't capable of. And so I definitely got a fresher and kinder perspective on her from
That's what our podcast is all about.
There we go. And so you're right. There are lovely parts of the book where she talks about like relying on your girlfriends, like when your heart gets broken. She talks about calling your friends and having them come over, and and they'll take care of you. And she talks about enjoying the independence of living alone and kind of fashioning your home the way you want to do it, and like fashion tips and decorating tips. She's got all those, and she talks about living thriftily, like different ways to save money, and it was fun. I resonated with that, and I also resonate with her enjoyment of men's company. Like, I've had male friends over the years, and I have some now, and there can be like a kind of a chivalry and a banter that hinges on the gender difference that's delightful, but it's not sexual or erotic at all.
Right, but you need rules bounding that to make that possible. Yes. Like, I didn't really have any true male friendships until I was married.
Interesting. Maybe because being married introduced the rules?
Because it shifted the dynamics enough to everybody knew where they were.
Okay, interesting. Okay, well, I think from the way that I was raised, there was this emphasis on, like, other men are like your brothers in Christ, right? And so it was this automatic, like, sibling assumption. If they're much older, they're like a father to you, and if they're your age, they're like a brother to you, unless you're in a romantic relationship with that one person, then they're not. But so it emphasized this. Well, of course you can enjoy each other's company, and you can connect that way.
Right, it's not the Mike Pence rule where he, like, won't go out to dinner with anyone,
no,
won't have a meal after 5 with... Or what's that? Like, you know what I'm
right.
talking
He
about.
won't go have dinner with it. Right. But I mean that sort of like purity culture is totally a part of an undercurrent in American Christianity.
Of course.
And I think it grows as a reaction to, look, the liberals are shrugging about sex. Quick, we got to batten down the hatches and get super tight. Like this is like super special. But then it also becomes this like what's the word? Youth pastors would like bill, sex on your wedding night as like the most amazing thing. Like, if you just wait for it, it's going to be amazing. It's like sexual prosperity gospel. Like, you got to hold on, keep it in your pants. Then it's going to be amazing. And then, then people get married and they're like, oh, this isn't quite what I like.
Right.
This isn't.
No,
this
you
isn't
can't live up to that because you need the experience.
So
you need to. I mean, part of intimacy is repetition.
Exactly. And so, so a lot of Christians end up getting like disappointed, like, oh, this is harder than I thought, or we're having issues, or it's not working out, But yeah, the purity culture is definitely a reaction to the shrug. But all that to say, like, I can see why male company would be like a really like exciting, heady thing for Brown. Mm-hmm. Like, it's fun. I enjoy times when I'm like, I'm part of a book club that's like all men except for me. And it's super fun to be in the room to kind of like talk like one of the guys. It's very different than being in a room full of women and talking with other women where you'll have text and subtext is really what matters. It's all subtext, right? Like, the text could be about nothing. It doesn't matter. It's the subtext. But when you're in a room full of men, it's all text, and they're like, there is no subtext. And it's such a relief.
Yeah.
It's fun. It's really fun.
It's the other half of the population. You'd have to make you have to be a very specific kind of person to choose to live entirely without socialization with the other half.
Yes.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
There's a very narrow band of people who live like that.
Mm-hmm.
For a reason. Because we enjoy each other.
We do. The difference can be really fun. It can be very, very alluring and mysterious, and without it having to be like sexual.
Right.
So I appreciate it. You helped me see like, oh, some of that was going on with Brown, and that's great. Yeah. So, and I also want to add, like, I watched the documentary on Mary Tyler Moore that you recommended. And I love the documentary.
It's so well
great.
done.
It's very well done. And I love Mary as like the real human being that she was. I love the character of Mary Richards from the Mary Tyler Moore show. The single working girl in Minneapolis at the news station. I watched every single episode of that show as a teen, probably more than once. And she definitely was an inspiration to me. Like, she modeled working woman in a beautiful way for me. And I also watched every single episode of the Dick Van Dyke Show more than once, where Mary played this 1960s housewife named Laura Petrie. And I loved her character there as a wife and a mom. And as a kid, I never saw those two roles of hers as being in competition with each other. I liked both. I saw the value in both. And they both had an influence on me, like in a really, really positive way. So
I told you this story by text the other day, but I'm going to tell it again here on the podcast because I think it's relevant. I went to a retirement celebration of 2 professors of computer science, one male, one female. Both had served as chairs of the department at one point. So after the tribute videos and congratulations from colleagues and family in the room, each of these former professors, retiring professors, makes their own speech. And the man gets up and thanks all these people, and he thanks his wife last. Which is sort of sign of, like, specialness. Like, it's not like he's being mean. But because for him, there's a symbolism to it that I think that is there. A supportive wife is a bonus. A genuine pleasure, no doubt, but a bonus.
Yes.
The woman, instead, gets up and thanks her husband first.
Yes.
Because without a supportive husband, she could not have had such a career at all.
Right.
Both of these families, by coincidence, had 2 daughters. And the daughters of the female former chair spoke about how their mother's career made their childhoods atypical. Most mothers don't take their young children to server rooms or faculty meetings, but it also made them very proud of her. And also, she emphasized her thanks to other people, especially long-serving staff, for their service. And that made me think about Victoria Smith and her complaints about women having to do all or most or more of the service work.
Yeah.
And here was a woman who had a career and a family and done a lot of service work specifically to attract other women to the field and to progress in the field, like get a PhD if they were going to stop at the master's and such. And she also benefited from the service of a lot of other women in particular. So equality doesn't mean women somehow magically being relieved of service work. I just don't understand this fetish about that. Yeah. It means integrating service work into a career.
Yeah.
And many women are capable of this. I'm not saying it's easy, but it's more realistic, I think, than simply expressing a lot of resentment about women having to do things.
Right.
That men get a pass on. I guess I'm at the point where I think that women are socialized different from men because they are different from men.
Yeah.
And it's necessary.
Yeah.
I don't envision a world where women don't do things that women do.
Yeah.
We can do them differently, like we can have premarital sex. We don't have to get married at 19. We don't have to be called spinsters at 30. But, like, there's limits. There's reality.
Yeah.
And reality is, women tend to be drawn to these roles, socialized to do them. It's not that you can't opt out. I mean, if you want to go, have a job and live alone and not have a husband and not have any children, you're free to do that.
Go do it. Yeah.
Go do it. But this idea that there's this panacea awaiting women when they no longer have to do those things, it just seems very unrealistic and also just very, what's the word I'm looking for here? It just seems like impoverished, that kind of view of the world.
Yeah, I agree.
It seems anti-intimate in its own way.
Yeah.
Right? Okay. I guess, are we ready to turn to Perry now?
Let's look at Perry.
Okay.
Yeah. First responses.
So, this idea that men and women are different, that is essentially the premise of Perry's book. That socialization is necessary to compensate for the innate, biologically based differences between men and women. In her case, she's speaking specifically with regard to sex. In the aggregate, heterosexual men want more sex with a greater variety of women than women do. And so if you have a culture where men are put under effective social pressure to be monogamous, or at least serially monogamous, you've created a dating and mating culture that serves women by honoring their aggregate preferences. I mean, I can see this in the world that Brown describes, right? She talks about the girl. And the only way a woman can be the girl that is being doted on or favored by some man or other is a world where men are socialized to treat women that way.
Yeah.
To go this far and no further.
Yes.
And I want to emphasize that this kind of socialization isn't a kind of brainwashing. Right? Many men really enjoy monogamy.
Yeah.
And still more come to accept that its benefits outweigh its downsides.
Yeah. And
of course, some men will pursue sexual variety and accept whatever it costs them socially. There have always been cads. And Brown herself mentions them, calling them Don Juans.
Exactly.
Right? So this is one side of the story. This pressure men to behave better. The other side is that women were also socialized to reward men with their chastity. And of course, the risk of pregnancy reinforced that social expectation. And it was this built-in imbalance that the sexual revolution was against. Women should have the same sexual freedom as men. That's the rallying cry. And Perry lays out, I dare say, a pretty solid case about how this notion of balancing sexual freedom was a misunderstanding of what the social mores around male monogamy and female chastity were. In essence, this misunderstanding consists, I think, in the fact that these two things are related, even interdependent. Because if women don't have to worry about pregnancy, men don't have to either. And furthermore, if the goal is equality, then the message you have to tell women is that they should want to have casual sex. It's actually kind of bonkers, really, to base your notion of sexual mores on what makes you more like men rather than on what you feel. Yeah. I'll take Brown over that bullshit any day.
Yes.
She's not confused about women wanting intimacy.
That's right. Yeah, great point. And it's true. And I completely agree with what you just said, that if women don't have to worry about pregnancy, men don't have to worry about it either. And that's like exactly what happened. That's how the change happened. So I really liked The Case Against the Sexual Revolution, which is probably no surprise to anybody. I liked it for multiple reasons. One, it's very well researched and well written, and it's clear that Perry cares very much about the truth and is trying to make contact with it. And two, she's making a data-driven case for the ways that the sexual revolution ended up hurting women. And seeing that data actually felt kind of gratifying to me because it confirmed that like the traditional religious and moral hedges around sex that I grew up with served an important purpose. Like they aren't necessarily bigotry or prudery, which is how conservatism around sex is commonly framed so that it can be dismissed, right? But Perry is basically saying, here's what happened to us in the decades since we removed Chesterton's fence around sex. How's that working out for you? And it's fascinating to hear this approach from a liberal who's not drawing on any explicitly religious perspective. And yet she's saying something that Catholics have been saying since forever, which is that virtue and happiness are actually the same thing. And that unfettered freedom makes most people miserable. So Perry isn't saying, don't be a bad person, as if she were like guilt-tripping people. She's saying, especially to women, don't you want to be happy? And she lays out chapter by chapter a fairly traditional perspective on sex, not completely, but reasonably traditional. And it makes it appear as though marriage and chivalry and family life are not the sources of women's oppression and misery, but are actually the best means humans have devised for coping with life's inevitable problems and for managing the irreducible differences between men and women. And a core thesis of her book is that men and women are different both in their bodies and in their motivations. And these differences are perhaps most acute in the area of sexuality. And so we have to face these differences head on and come to terms with them culturally. And as Kathleen Stock says in her foreword to Perry's book, there are plenty of reasons to be wary of contemporary sexual mores that are perfectly secular. So even though the conclusions in Perry's book resonate with religious mores, you do not need to be religious to reach those conclusions. They can stand on their own, which is very interesting. It means that a path to sexual flourishing between men and women is discoverable apart from some sort of supernatural revelation. Like we can find this path by attuning to our embodied nature, particularly to the female nature. Female sexual preferences are influenced by maternal potential, whether or not babies ever actually enter into the picture for a particular individual. And that maternal potential carries with it a certain wisdom about the future, since children are literally the future. And that should take priority if our species wants to keep existing. You know that old phrase, like, if mama ain't happy, ain't nobody happy? I think that applies to Perry's sexual ethics here. Like, she's saying, if the majority of heterosexual women aren't happy with the current state of our sexual culture, then it's actually failing everybody. And it needs to be re-examined, rather than concluding, oh, most straight women are just prudes having a moral panic. Like, that is not the right conclusion to draw. Perry takes her stand with Mary Wollstonecraft when she quotes her at the opening of the book. The little respect paid to chastity in the male world is, I am persuaded, the grand source of many of the physical and moral evils that torment mankind, as well as of the vices and follies that degrade and destroy women. So, like Brown, Perry's concerned about women's happiness, but unlike Brown, Perry's convinced that the only way to secure women's happiness on the sexual front is for women to act in ways that motivate male sexual behavior to bring it into alignment with what allows for most women to flourish. So, whereas Brown is encouraging women to align their behavior with that of the average bachelor or cheating married man, she's saying, use him for your own pleasure, because he sure as hell is using you. So Brown and Perry agree that men and women are different, but they're conveying opposing messages about who should change. Like, should men adapt to suit women? Should we nudge them from cads into dads? Or should women adapt to suit men? Like, should we have the privilege of being cads too? That's the question, I think.
I mean, I feel like the title of Brown's book is really misleading, because I'm not really sure that what she says about her relationships and sex in them is that it doesn't really seem to be just about sex. That seems like that whole line seems like just the necessary extremity to push back against the idea that you couldn't do it and you couldn't say it. I don't really think she's talking about fucking for fun.
Really?
I really don't. I really think she's talking about I don't need marriage to condone this relationship. I really think it should have been called The Single Person Who Isn't a Virgin. I don't know. Single, not spinster? I don't know.
There you go. Yeah.
Anyway, go on.
Okay. Well, I take your point. You're right. Brown isn't just talking about using men for sex. But I think she's still talking about using. That's the thing. If she's talking about using them for emotional gratification and attention, right? Like, I think she's very straightforward about the pleasure of having a man fall for you, even if you never sleep with him, you know, but she still wants the attention.
Yes.
And while I grant that's better than using men for sex, it still strikes me as self-absorbed, you know, and not like mature enough to count as real love. And frankly, I'm saying this because it reminds me of myself in middle school.
Oh, yeah.
And like my attempts at flirting and the delight of getting boys' attention and having admirers. Oh, like when you're a young woman and you're just coming into
your power.
There's a sexual power of like, I can get these guys looking at me, and I mean, I'm saying this as like a good modest Christian girl, like fully clothed. Like it's not like
it doesn't matter though, because it's about energy.
Yes, yeah.
And boys like, they don't need porn. They have a porn beneath their eyelids 24/7. At least that's what I've heard.
Yeah. So that was fun. Yeah. I liked drawing that kind of attention to myself. Like, but
so you're saying she's like an overgrown adolescent?
I'm saying that without saying that. Yes.
I mean, that's actually a fair critique of the like. It's certainly, the language certainly lends itself to that, even though she's behaving like an adult. But her language is all like.
Yeah, she could have been more mature than her language portrays. Like, she doesn't do herself any favors with this sort of like, oh, like they're cavalier, the thing she'll just throw out there. Like, maybe she's trying to get a reaction. Maybe it's part of the magazine style.
She's trying to resist you have to say it with complete and utter shamelessness to say it at all.
Maybe that's what it has to be.
That's what it is. I think if you... Okay. The fact, I mean, it's like you couldn't be a divorcee on television. That's why she has to say it like that.
Okay.
I think that's what it is, but we weren't there.
So. But I think, like, so I see what she's doing is flirting, but I believe that flirting is meant to serve a purpose. Like, I think it's a part of the whole, right? Like, it should be in service to a more serious romantic trajectory. Like, it's a way of warming up to that, right? Like, it's what you do when you're young. You're practicing. Right. And so I just felt uncomfortable seeing Brown extend what I think of as like the adolescent warm-ups into adulthood, like really far into adulthood, you know, and that it's possible that's unfair of me.
Well, the alternative is like, I mean, you have a very long and successful marriage, but so many of these young marriages would have failed. Yeah. That's the other side of that.
Right.
It's like, don't get married. I mean, like, do you know why Elizabeth Taylor got married so many times?
No.
Because she wouldn't have sex unless she was married.
Really?
Yeah.
I did not know that.
True fact.
Interesting.
Yeah.
How many marriages did she have?
Like 9?
Like 6? 9?
Was it 9? I think she married the same person twice.
Okay, I think she did.
Okay, show notes. I'll put it in there. I don't know. There's a lot of marriages.
Oh, yeah.
Man. That's why. And I found that out. I was like, oh, that's so weird. Why didn't they just have sex? And I was like, oh, because it was then.
Right. Yeah. Yep, that's different. Yeah. So to this issue of of women feeling empowered to act more promiscuously, like maybe in Brown's day, like you pointed out, when the overall culture was still kind of by and large Protestant-ish, a few women being a little more promiscuous doesn't change the calculus, right? Like, but at scale across decades, it becomes this problem of the commons, or like the problem of litter, or someone peeing in the pool, right? A little bit's okay, but if everybody acts like you, we are in trouble. So, I mean, this is an old problem. It's Kant's categorical imperative, right? He says, act only according to that maxim whereby you can at the same time will that it should become a universal law. So the question is, does contraception-dependent liberated sex scale well? And I think when promiscuity went from being like the exception to the rule, from what only the cool kids did, to something commonplace, like that's when we can judge the legitimacy of this path. When like everybody and their mother's doing it, how does it look?
And it didn't go that way in a uniform way. It went in a very marked way.
That's right. It goes first, shall we say. Yeah, and this
no, but I mean like the ill effects. I mean the other way. I mean, free love might have been like associated with liberals, but it's liberals who still got married in the end.
That's true.
They didn't have the out of wedlock. If you look at the out of wedlock birth rates, they correlate with income very closely.
That's right. Yeah. Yeah. And so this is why my bullshit detector went off reading Brown, because I feel like she was trying to get away with something, and she succeeded in getting away with it because she was an anomaly in that environment. You know, but women today can't get off scot-free like she did, because the men have collectively adapted to our new conditions. They aren't troubadours anymore, right? They're porn addicts. And so, yeah, things have changed.
Yeah, it's Helen Gurley Brown with her men they're on this they're this marginal group of people who are, you know, they're engaging in this behavior that isn't very common, probably. Still, I mean, because you know, most women are getting married young.
Yep.
And not necessarily because they intend to be married the rest of their lives. I mean, but marriage was one of the ways that you matured.
Right.
I mean, my parents were both married to other people. In fact, when they first met, because they met through work. So, I mean, it was normal to, I think my mother got married in college.
Oh, wow.
And, like, eloped.
Yep.
And I think my father got married soon, like, it's around the same age. It was really common. I mean, it was normal. I mean, at the same time, you're not living with your parents till you're 26 either.
Right.
I mean, you're moving out at 18, and you're either going to college on your own, or you're getting a job, and you're living with roommates, or you're getting married. I mean, it was an adulting. They didn't have to call it that. Right. It wasn't a performance. It was actual life.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's a good point. Yeah. All right, so let's move on to some more quotes. We're going to talk a little bit about sexual disenchantment. So there are a lot of different ways that one can characterize what happened during the sexual revolution. And some of the positive ways would be to call it liberation from old stigmas, liberation from family strictures and structures, and freedom from the risk of unwanted pregnancy. People were celebrating and experimenting with free love and with sexual self-expression. But another way to describe what happened in the sexual revolution is to call it sexual disenchantment. And it's interesting, I looked up the word disenchantment, and Merriam-Webster defined it as being freed from illusion, which of course assumes that whatever was previously captivating you is fake, right? As if you were under a spell, and it's good to be free from it, right? There's the liberation. But the Cambridge Dictionary defined disenchantment as the feeling of no longer believing in the value of something, which is totally different. And this definition assumes the possibility that something actually had a meaning to it, but you just don't believe in it anymore. Like, you can't perceive it. The change is in you, not necessarily in the world or in that thing. So, one kind of disenchantment is like Dorothy pulling back the curtain to reveal the little man behind the screen in Wizard of Oz, right? And the other disenchantment is more like the result of being traumatized, or like, losing a capacity you once had, like the onset of blindness or something. And I think the sexual disenchantment that happened in the sexual revolution is more like the second kind of disenchantment. The new technologies, like the pill, like the mainstreaming of pornography, enabled new types of behavior, and those behaviors triggered a change in our perceptions and experiences. So we could no longer believe in the value of sex and like the dramatic and symbolic power of it. We ceased to see it as metaphysically charged with meaning, and it lost some of its specialness, its intimacy, its mystery. And sex has become, like you mentioned when you talked about the show Euphoria, anti-intimate. In other words, having no value beyond individual pleasure. And both Brown and Perry refer to this disenchantment. I think Brown epitomizes it with her cavalier attitude, and Perry critiques it. Here's Brown.
It seems to me the solution is not to rule out married men, but to keep them as pets. While they are using you to varnish their egos, you use them to add spice to your life. I say them advisedly. One married man is dangerous. A potpourri can be fun. What about the harm you may do to his wife? I'm afraid I have a rather cavalier attitude about wives. The reason is this. A wife, if she is loving and smart, will get her husband back every time. He doesn't really want her not to. He's only playing. She may have played herself on occasion. If she doesn't get him back, it's probably because she's lazy, blind, or doesn't want him. It's a question of taking married men but not taking them seriously. And not taking them home too often. Don't try to marry one. Use them in a perfectly nice way, just the way they use you. See? It's not about sex. It's like, for lobster dinners.
That's right, for lobster
dinners. She
says
don't take them home too often.
Too often. There's the too often, right? So I think she's being coy.
She's acknowledging, though, that if you fall in love, and she's implying here that sexual intimacy promotes attachment. She doesn't even have to say it. She doesn't even have to say it because her audience knows it's so.
That's right. That's a good point. And in that way, she is much more sort of grounded and traditional in her intuitions.
She's reality-based.
Reality-based.
On that level.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. But still, I'm still mad at her for, like, insinuating herself into, like, someone else's covenant for the sake of your own flirtatious, like, adding spice to my life. Like, that bugs me.
It's not very virtuous.
It's not.
I'll give you that.
So and it strikes close to home for me because I had a dear friend many years ago whose husband was caught up in like an emotional affair, and it was just devastating for her. It nearly destroyed their marriage, and they had like a young son together. And so like I was on the side of like seeing all the damage that can happen from from what, you know, Brown portrays as like, oh, this sort of fun,
right,
adding spice,
she's
blah,
completely...
blah. And I'm like, what about the whole context of the whole family? What about that little boy? Like, what if his father had gone off? And, you know, like, it's just like, don't you see the threads that you're cutting by, you know, like, it's just hard for me.
Right. She's so intent on having this liberatory experience that she's lost sight of all the implications for virtue and how violating those virtues causes destruction.
Yeah, it's like this collateral damage. She's kind of the bull in the china shop. Is how it felt reading her. And again, it's not as though she was like trying. She doesn't come at all across as like malicious or anything. But it is this sort of like, the bull in the china shop, knocking things over. Whoops, didn't see that there. Just kind of casual oops destruction, you know. And I have that gets me going. Anyway, so here's a quote from Perry on Disenchantment. I am critical of any ideology that fails to balance freedom against other values. And I'm also critical of the failure of liberal feminism to interrogate where a desire for a certain type of freedom comes from, too often referring back to a circular logic by which a woman's choices are good because she chooses them. Just like Sex and the City's Charlotte York yelping, I choose my choice! I choose my choice! Sexual disenchantment is a natural consequence of the liberal privileging of freedom over all other values. Because if you want to be utterly free, you have to take aim at any kind of social restrictions that limit you, particularly the belief that sex has some unique intangible value, some specialness that is difficult to rationalize. From this belief in the specialness of sex comes a host of potentially unwelcome phenomena, including patriarchal religious systems. But when we attempt to disenchant sex, and so pretend that this particular act is neither uniquely wonderful nor uniquely violating, then there is another kind of cost. That cost falls disproportionately on women.
That's all very well argued. I mean, I think Perry's book is great, and I feel like the fact that it took this long for someone to say those things is... it had to get this bad for her to...
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
But I've really talked myself into making Brown a useful lens through which to read Perry here.
Okay.
Definitely the costs of disenchanted sex fall on women. Mm-hmm. And many of those costs are specific to the sexual act, like bad sex, rough sex, unplanned childlessness. But I think Brown has convinced me that the real thing missing is actual intimacy. Mm-hmm. The kind of dinner dates and cooking a meal. Yeah. If sex without catching feelings is billed as the highest form of personal liberation, then young people don't ever learn to do these things. Right. And then neither men nor women learn how to create intimacy, mm-hmm. which begins way before the bedroom.
Yes.
It's all fucking and no wooing.
Exactly.
And I think most women, not to mention most men, are not benefiting from this. Yeah. It makes me really sad that young people, especially young women, are falling for this bullshit. Yep. I mean, there's people who define only wanting to have sex with someone you actually feel romantic feelings for as a kind of sexuality. They call it demisexuality. That's like just being a typical heterosexual female.
Right. That's just being a woman.
That's just being a woman. I shudder to think. I could have fallen for all this crap. Mm.
I agree with you that, like, Brown does elevate the pleasures of romance, right? Like, of dating, candlelight dinners, courtship. Like, she has high standards for, like, oh, he's got to take you out to a nice restaurant. You know? She has high standards. And you're right. Those things have just fallen by the wayside today. And that's terrible for both men and women.
And why is it feminist that those things are gone? It's like, this is the baby out with the bathwater thing.
For sure.
Right?
For sure. Yeah, I guess that they're contaminated with the idea of patriarchy. Like, it's condescending or something if he pays for your dinner. I don't know.
I don't get it.
Yeah.
I don't get it.
I love chivalry. I think it's great. So,
chivalry is why men love women. They love doing that.
Yeah.
I mean, not all men, maybe, but good men.
Good men do. We love good men.
We love good men.
Yeah. So a meaningful takeaway from reading Sex and the Single Girl would be her tips for hosting a date, cooking a fancy meal for your date, being hospitable and romantic so that the man in your life feels cared about. Like, she even had these little details like, oh, and again, this assumes he's spending the night, but like, oh, like, leave nice fresh towels in the bathroom for him, and like, put in like extra razors and like a little like ashtray for when he's smoking. Like, but the point is, like, she's attending to these details.
Right.
Because she cares about his experience. She cares about hosting him and creating an environment. Like, that is deeply erotic and romantic.
Yes.
Right? And I would say, I think that kind of attention is meant for marriage, right? Like, that's my belief. But she's doing a good thing in doing that, right? That kind of care and attention to detail is very erotic and loving. So, Yeah. So, okay, points for Brown. So she retains some of the enchantment associated with male-female courtship rituals and intimacy.
Right. And in fact, I mean, her book is How to Have Sex Before You Get Married But Get Married. I mean, maybe that's the title.
Say it again. How to have
sex before you're married but end up getting married. I mean, because she marries late. She marries at the age I married, but she just didn't want to marry the wrong person.
Yeah.
That's the way I look at it.
She seemed very happy with the man she married.
And as soon as she found the one she wanted to marry, she locked that shit down. If you liked it, should have put a ring on it. She did that.
She does that. Yes, she does. Put a ring on it.
I mean,
she kind of forces him into it. She's like, now or never, I'm out of here.
Right.
You better propose.
Right. Exactly. No, I mean, I think that's classic.
Yeah. Yeah. She's rather traditional.
She's super traditional. It's just that there's this veneer of liberatory, vapid, consumerist.
Yeah. She talks
transactional.
A big game. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I mean, it's
a kind of a bravado.
And it's tragic that people, as we've said, did what she said, not what she did.
Yeah. Yep. Yeah. So about Perry's quote on sexual disenchantment. She's criticizing the liberal privileging of freedom above all other values, which means that stigma itself is stigmatized. Like, the one thing you can't do is make someone else feel bad about their sexual desires or sexual behavior.
Which is so bogus.
I agree.
I mean, this the people who want to call pedophiles minor attracted persons.
Yeah,
nope. God forbid we stigmatize the pedophile.
Yeah. No.
What the actual fuck? That's not a liberal value. That's not a liberal value. That's just messed up.
Amen.
It's
yeah. It's gone way too far, way too far. So there's this article by Helen Lewis in The Atlantic called The Problem with Being Cool About Sex, where she writes of her generation of feminists in their 30s. She says, being cool about sex is a mark of our impeccable social liberalism. If two or more adults consent to it, whatever it is, no one else is entitled to an opinion. Yet here is the conundrum facing feminist writers. Our enlightened values, less stigma regarding unwed mothers, the acceptance of homosexuality, greater economic freedom for women, the availability of contraception, and the embrace of consent culture haven't translated into anything like a paradise of guilt-free fun.
So it sounds good, but doesn't work at all.
It doesn't work. Right. It just doesn't. So the ability to hold an attitude that is, all in caps, cool about sex, requires disenchantment, right? This perspective that sex isn't a big deal. Because if it's not a big deal, if it falls in the category of preferences like Crest or Colgate, or any other consumer choice, right? Then nobody gets to be on the high horse. Nobody can judge you for choosing your choice, right? Mm. Because it's a consumer choice. But Helen Gurley Brown portrayed her form of sexually active singleness as sort of maybe not a paradise of guilt-free fun, but certainly guilt-free fun with a heavy side of heartbreak. Because she acknowledges you get your heart broken, but then you patch it up and then you move on. But she was incredibly cool about sex, at least as she wrote it.
She was deliberate about sex.
Deliberate about sex. Maybe that's more true. Because you're right, there's cool about sex wouldn't put an ashtray in the bathroom for the guy to,
I mean, the only thing that book really departs from in the mores of her time is that she's doing it without the ring on. That's it. Everything else is classic. If you took out the part of the book,
but she's doing it with a lot of different men without the ring on.
Well, she's saying she's doing it with a lot of different men, but how many different men really are there? I mean, maybe she's adding some on.
I don't know.
Maybe she only went to second base with half the guys. I mean,
yeah, that's right, because she's not. She alludes to things, but she's not, and so it's fill in the blanks. I filled in the blanks with she's having sex with lots of different men. But it sounds like you were sort of filling in the blanks with sounds like she flirted, dated, and maybe fooled around with a lot of different men, but the actual sexual encounters may have been a lot less than she lets on.
Well, and I certainly don't think they took place in the context of, getting drunk one night at a bar and going home with somebody.
No. They would have been in the context of, a super romantic date where she's, picking the records to play.
Right, and it wouldn't have been on the first date that she's sleeping with them. Because, there's a...
It's a plan.
She's coming from this perspective that both sexes understood the stages of intimacy. Really all she's disagreeing with is, when do you get to the fun? When do you get to the sex part?
Okay, yeah.
I mean,
yeah.
I don't know. I just see it as more, I would I would wish any young woman that book rather than some of the really, truly disenchanted crap that we read about.
Yeah. That's true. That's true.
I mean, it doesn't mean that it's either are great. That's but right. It means that one is clearly better.
Yeah. And I think that maybe partly what accounts for our different perspectives on here is like, I'm starting from a place of like, oh, sex is only for marriage. And then I read Brown and I'm like, oh, you naughty girl. Right? And you're starting from like, this is what our sexual culture is like today. It's crap. And you're like, oh, she's a lot better than that. Right? Like, so we're just coming at it from like, she looks libertine to me, but she looks conservative to you. You know.
Well, she looks like traditionalist with the one exception that she's unabashedly not ashamed of premarital sex. Right. Which, that's a prior I have. So, for me, it feels like, oh, okay.
Right.
You're actually going to cook him dinner? Why?
So this is interesting. That feeds into the next thing I was going to say. Because, you know, if what you're saying is like, okay, Helen Gurley Brown is somewhat traditional. She just scooted the stigma markers over a little bit to be like, okay, premarital sex is okay. Right? Like, she's scooting it. You know, or say something like, oh, let's let married people use contraception, or let's have gay people get married. Like, you sort of have a limited set of.
She wasn't that. We'll talk about that.
Sure, but I mean, like the liberal idea of like, let's just open up the. You know, we're not opening the floodgates. We're just going to expand. Like, let's include the gay people in marriage.
Right.
Let's include. You know, you're stretching, right? You're sort of like a little more into normativity. Then the norm gets a little bit bigger, right? Seems to be the intention. Like, but you're not doing away with normness. You're not doing away with boundaries. You're increasing who gets to be in the normal category, right? But I think the most left-leaning positions today are attempting to do away with stigma and heteronormativity altogether. Like, I think that's the meaning of the rainbow bumper sticker I keep seeing all around town, love is love, which to me translates into nothing is sacred. Like, everything's the same. Nothing is better or worse than anything else. Is what I think that means.
Yeah, although I think the meaning of that in the beginning of that campaign towards decriminalizing and demedicalizing homosexuality was that it was trying to say and fit it on a bumper sticker that homosexuality is not a mental disorder.
Right. And I
absolutely agree that it had that effect that you described.
Yeah, I mean it just seems like that sort of snowball phenomenon, like, oh, good intention for the first step, and then like,
well, it's like you do
the 20 steps after that become nuts.
Yes,
and you're like, what is this project? How do you say like, we're going to keep that homosexuality is not criminalized and medicalized, but we're not going to
call pedophiles minor attracted persons.
Right. Like, how do you find that? How do you find that spot? Right. And it's people like Perry who are asking, how can we re-enchant sex and learn to honor it as special without relying on a religious narrative to do so? Because the very enchanted perspective on sex that I grew up with and that I still maintain and experience to this day is rooted in what I call an iconic perspective on sex. It's the idea that the sexual union of male and female is an earthly icon of a heavenly reality. So in the first chapter of Genesis, there's this litany of archetypal pairings within creation, like heaven and earth, day and night, sun and moon, land and sea, right? It's very beautiful and poetic. And the crown and pinnacle of that litany is man and woman. So God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him. Male and female, he created them. And in chapter 2, you've got this image of Eve being taken from the side of Adam. And it's not a rib, it's like rib cage. It's like the entire side of his body. It's like his other half. Yeah.
Oh.
Yeah, it's like and she's brought to him, and then there's this beautiful poem about sexual union. Then the man said, "This at last is bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh. She shall be called woman because she was taken out of man. Therefore a man shall leave his father and his mother and hold fast to his wife, and they shall become one flesh. And the man and his wife are both naked and were not ashamed." And so you've got this like iconic picture of sex as a synecdoche, which is, I love that word, it's a fancy word. It's a shorthand that stands in for the whole, which is marriage. And so that microcosm of sex is embedded in this larger macrocosm of marriage, and marriage itself is embedded in these like macrocosmic archetypal pairings of creation. So it's a fractal and fruitful picture of nested parts within wholes. And then the whole story of the Bible is this picture of God as the bridegroom wooing, there's the romance, wooing and winning his creation as the bride. And sex exemplifies the union of heaven and earth. Right, so if you tinker with the icon, then you're creating a whole new theological meaning. And that is why sex has very high stakes within Christendom, historically. It's not because Christians are prudes. We love sex. But it's because earth is an icon of heaven. And so that's the symbolism, like the mythos, the meaning, the enchanted vision of sex. And it's heavy. Like, right? Like, it's weighted with sacredness, and therefore it stigmatizes everything but a very particular arrangement of one man and one woman in fruitful and faithful union for life. So it's very meaningful, but it's chock full of limits. Like, the meaningfulness and the narrowness are of a piece.
Right.
Right? And so liberalism wants to reduce the stigmas and to include more people and to allow for more freedom, right? And I get that. I feel the pull of that. Mm-hmm. Like, I feel the draw of it very much. But it appears to me that, like, the cost of that freedom and inclusion is disenchantment. Like, the cost of that destigmatization is a loss of a degree of sacredness, like some of the loss of the mystical drama. And I think that each person has to decide for themselves, like, what kind of trade-offs are worth it. But I don't think there is some path of, like, total freedom and total meaningfulness of, like, anything goes and sex really matters. Like, I mean, maybe you can push back on that, but I mean, maybe you can see a path that, like, balances these two things without damaging either one, but I struggle to see it. I think people like Louise Perry and Mary Harrington are interested in a meaningful, intimate, and virtuous sexual ethic that isn't freighted with all these metaphysical meanings, because many people aren't going to be able to believe that today. You know, that's just not an option for a lot of people. And I think a lot of Protestant Christians are aiming for, like, a middle ground that isn't as limiting as, like, the Catholic sexual ethic, which is really, really heavily freighted. But it also isn't as loose as the broader culture, right? And so even though I'm religious, I'm interested in the secular case for sexual ethics because, like I said earlier, I think virtue and happiness are the same thing. And I'd love for people to be happy. I'd love to see people flourish no matter what they believe.
Well, I don't think I can, like, make a counter argument to Genesis. I think that's a lot to pull out of my hat, even from my hat. But I agree that virtue and happiness are the same thing. I mean, even in a secular Jewish context, where I grew up, that connection was entirely clear to me and regularly reinforced. I'll talk more about this later, but I think where this idea meets sexual ethics is in the realization that unmarried or even casual sex doesn't have to be immoral, but at the same time, it can still fall short, dare we say, miss the mark, in terms of producing what makes sex genuinely worthwhile, intimacy.
Yes. Yeah.
Because I agree, that is like a narrow path to navigate. How you can still understand that there are unvirtuous and virtuous choices, even if you reserve judgment in some ways of a particular act's morality or immorality.
Right.
I don't know how that gets expressed except by modeling. It's because you realize if your parents are together. Because, I mean, I knew my father had been married before for a long time. It actually wasn't until, like, one of her best friends, like, spilled the beans to me when I was, like, 14 or something. Really? He was like, didn't you know your mother was married before? And I was like, oh, scandalous! Right?
Interesting.
Right.
Yeah.
She didn't like to talk about it.
Oh, okay.
But I think you get that idea that people are making choices whose significances are very particular and obvious and not casual. Mm-hmm. I mean, especially since I did know the story about my dad's vasectomy that he got in the context of his first marriage and then had reversed. So I think I always sensed that people's choices had ramifications, significant ones. Mm-hmm. And I think that's kind of maybe the context where I intuited that that things were significant even if they weren't couched in a narrative like the Bible of that endowed them with that significance.
Right. Like your family is the story.
Yes.
Rather than the religion being the story. Yeah.
My parents went through a little bit of a rough patch when I left for college, and which is I don't think unusual. Yeah. And my father would tell me, he's like, I don't do divorce. Because they understood that this was like, you just worked it out.
They're in it.
Because you're in it to win it.
Yeah. And that is a real gift they gave you.
Yes.
They gave you that story of my parents are always together.
Right.
Yeah.
And it's not easy, but commitment isn't easy. But you do it because it's worth it. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And I think, and that becomes a double-edged sword. I mean, I married a man who was married to his first wife for 30-something years. Oh. Mm-hmm. And, I think he would have stayed under other certain conditions because he had that strong moral upbringing. Yeah. But, so it's hard. Like, I think some people get luckier than others.
Yes.
Like, you can have people who are equally virtuous, but one couple isn't as lucky as another.
That's very true. Yeah. Yeah, again, there's so much about life that we can't control, and you don't know what's going to happen to you, and yeah, all kinds of things can just like kick the legs out from a marriage. All kinds of suffering can do that.
Right.
All kinds of.
And so I think one of the things socially driving this path towards liberalization with this sort of destigmatification of divorce, especially, was just looking at all the unhappiness that those standards were creating.
Right.
And I agree that you can take that too far.
Right.
We've taken it too far. I'm on the same page with that. But I think a lot of it was like, why are we making ourselves miserable if we see that relaxing these standards or this stigma can actually help? There's no easy way to know when to stop. True.
That's right.
But I think divorce in particular. Have you ever watched all those old movies about like people having to go to Nevada to like get their quick divorce? I mean, there's like a whole genre.
No.
Yeah, before there was no-fault divorce, like when Nevada was the only state that had no-fault divorce. Yeah. I mean, those kind of issues caused a lot of suffering. Like when you had to sort of frame up one of the partners as the adulterer because there was no-fault divorce in most states.
Like you had to like create the awful conditions to end.
You had to like... You look back on that and you're like, yeah, why do we have those laws? That's crazy. But on the other side, at the same time, people now enter into marriage thinking, oh, well, let's just get divorced.
Right. And something like 50% of marriages end in divorce. You're like, that's not what the people who wanted to make the exception to allow suffering people to get out were not thinking, let's move to a culture where half of all marriages end in divorce. Right. Like, that was not what they meant. But again, it's this snowball thing. It's like, how do you make a tweak? How do you make room for the exception without just, like, decimating the norm or decimating the rule? You know, like stigmas have force that maintain a center of gravity that keep things together through hardship, right? And so it's like, I don't know, that seems like a super thorny, difficult, worthwhile problem to think about, but how do we do that? I don't know.
I don't think there's an answer.
Yeah.